Good,
Again, no complaints.
good.
I used to say busier than a one-arm paper hanger.
Yeah, that covers it. Literally.
And as you know from your years here, council's actually it's a full-time job,
Hmm.
and
And
that's not a complaint.
we just went live, just so you know, it is up now.
Thank you.
Yep. And I do have the chat up. If there's any reason for us to have to chat internally, the chat is up.
Okay.
All right. Yep. All right. Well, good afternoon. I'm Carbon County, Pennsylvania Commissioner Chris Lukasevich. I want to thank all of you who are joining us, be it on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, or X. Today, we're going to have a discussion on the concept of overtourism and if and how it might apply to the seat of county government here in Carbon County, Jim Thorpe. The purpose of this conversation is for all of us to gain a better understanding of overtourism, its indicators, its warnings, so that we can better assess our tourism environment and potentially lay the groundwork for a tourism management strategy that is nested at all three levels of tourism here in our area: the Pocono Mountains region, the county, and down to the municipality level. During our discussion, specifically the panel or roundtable discussion, we're going to use the epicenter, I would argue, of Pocono Mountains tourism, and specifically of Carbon County. Undoubtedly, Jim Thorpe is kind of our subject to study and to apply some of the characteristics and principles of overtourism to. I'd like to briefly introduce the four who are joining me, and then we'll jump right into the concept of overtourism. First and foremost, I'd like to introduce Dr. Harold Goodwin, Emeritus Professor and Responsible Tourism Director at the Institute of Place Management at Manchester Metropolitan University. That's the Institute of Place Management at Manchester Metropolitan University in the United Kingdom, Managing Director of the Responsible Tourism Partnership, and advisor to the World Travel Market on its Responsible Tourism Program. And more locally, Marlon Kistner, Vice President in Membership and Community Relations of the Pocono Mountains Visitors Bureau. Kathy Henderson, the Director, Carbon Chamber and Economic Development Corporation, and Michael Rivkin, past president, current member of the Jim Thorpe Tourism Agency and co-owner of Dolan House Bed and Breakfast. Just give a little overview of how we're going to run the conduct or our agenda. We're going to start out with Marlon providing more of a macro overview of the tourism industry and the tourism environment in the Poconos and Carbon County. Then Michael will join us and go ahead and bring it down really to the micro level of Jim Thorpe to get us all kind of the context that we need to apply the concept that then Harold will kind of spend a good deal of time doing a deep dive, really an education on for all of us on the concept. And then we'll go ahead and open it up into a conversation for about our last 20 minutes. ultimately wrapping it up just prior to 3 o'clock. So with no further ado, let me introduce Dr. Harold Goodwin. Harold, over to you. And you're on mute, Harold.
Do you want me to talk, or are we going to listen to the others first?
Nope. Well, I'm sorry. Yep, we're gonna. I just wanted to give you a chance for any introductory comments you'd like to make before I turn it over to Marlon.
No, I'm fine and good to go. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Okay, Marlon, there you go.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you, Commissioner, for the invitation today. Really, I think as an organization, we are excited to be able to promote the Pocono region and also Carbon County. We also work really closely with our communities, which I think is extremely important, our local businesses. And I'm proud to say that Kathy and Michael, the three of us, work on a united front, which has been great. So I'm going to share my screen and talk a little bit about some of the stats, a little bit of an overview here. And I'm going to start with the Pocono region. So everybody knows we cover Carbon County, Monroe County, Pike, and Wayne. So we are a 4-county region. And our job is to promote the 4 counties in tourism and attractions. So to give you some stats, in 2022, we had 28 million guests visit the Pocono Mountains. Of the 28 million, approximately 2 million tourists visit Carbon County yearly. So that's 9% of that 28 million, just to give you an idea of the number of folks coming into Carbon County. To drill down a little bit more, tourism does account for 37% of the region's economy and 65% of the labor income. So we're a very tourist-driven region. And we employ over 4,000 Carbon County residents, also in traveler spending, or 11% of the spend of the 3.9 billion. Travel generates 36 million in state and local taxes. Federal taxes over 36 million. And to give you an idea of Carbon County's guest count, we do see upwards of 400,000 guests per year that come through the visitor center just in Jim Thorpe alone. So again, I think these numbers do speak to what Commissioner Lukasevich is, zoning in on. I think the thing that we're very excited to be able to do is to stay in close contact with our commissioners, with our local businesses, with all of our local leadership. So as we see things that are happening or busy times that are coming in, we have this great ability to work together to support the community. But also we want to make sure that the guest experience is a great one, so they keep coming back. And as you see with, the type of draw that we have, this is definitely going to trickle down to support a lot of local businesses. And that's really a goal of ours as well. So again, I'm just excited to be here and to be part of this conversation. And I'm going to turn it back over. And I think I want to make sure I'm stopping my screen share here. There we go.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Marlon. And understand, for those who are joining us, the Tourism Center, the Pocono Mountain Visitors Center in Jim Thorpe is a small visitor center. And I would suspect that 2 to 3 times, if not 4 times, the number of actual visitors are coming into Jim Thorpe. Because you might have onesies and twosies of each group coming in there, and plus the multitudes that never actually go through the doors there. So the numbers are significant. Michael, let's turn it over to you and talk specifically about Jim Thorpe.
Thank you, Commissioner. I appreciate that. So one thing I want to mention real quickly is I've been blessed to have been in 65 countries over the past 25, 30 years for business and pleasure. And it was either divided into business locations or tourist areas. And we got to witness firsthand over-tourism. And one thing that I think we can stress is that tourism has been basically a left or right topic. You either are for it in your community or you're against it. And the truth of the matter is that does not need to be the case. As Chris, as you mentioned, managing tourism is a very, very, very important part of not just the TPAs that we're working with, but also the local governments. The very definition of overtourism, and certainly Dr. Goodwin will likely definitely chime in on this, but the definition of overtourism is when the tourism levels now begin to negatively impact your residents. And I don't think we have an argument that we're seeing that in Jim Thorpe. Our various organizations, folks that are here today, our local governments, have endeavored to have events meetings for the past several years to address and mitigate and manage tourism, and they have been effective. The challenge that we have is that target that we strive to achieve raises each year. And so we'll set a target for 2022's tourism, and then 2023 comes along and blows that out of the water. The tourism brings a lot of positive benefits, and I think one benefit that can be expanded is sharing that fairy dust with our communities. I don't think there's any question about that. The other thing about managing tourism as opposed to just accepting it is when we manage it, which that's going to be a lot of sides to that argument. I know we'll have our roundtable, but when you manage it, you have a less likely chance of it diminishing away. You want to control it, but you don't want it to go away. And personally, my fear is if we don't properly manage it as a group, it will indeed go away. Jim Thorpe's appeal will diminish because the very things that people come here for won't be there. So that's a very important part. And I think it's important to stress that the JTTA, in conjunction certainly with Carbon County Chamber, definitely with PMVB, the last few years, Commissioner, have been less about promoting and more about providing accommodation. We know they're coming, and so our groups have worked on ensuring that there's information, restrooms, food and beverage. And so when they get here, they're not totally lost. I'll close with this for now. If there's one major target that our TPAs, I think, should put at the top of our list for 2024, we need to do a better job of outreach to potential visitors and teach them, educate them to do their homework. And what I mean by that is they need to know that there's X amount of parking, one road in and one road out, X amount of places to stay, X amount of places to eat and drink. So essentially, you must plan ahead. We're seeing this all over the world in major tourist attractions, Barcelona, Venice, British heritage sites in the UK, tickets are required. And so it forces one to do some homework. And the reality is that makes the visitor's experience infinitely more positive, as well as the experience for those that live here. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Michael. And we're going to go ahead and turn it right over to Harold.
Thank you very much. I was interested, Michael, particularly to hear what you were saying about the experience internationally. It's certainly, you clearly have been following what's happening. Is my screen showing appropriately?
Yep, you're
Yes.
good, Harold.
Yeah, good to go. Okay, I thought what I should do is just explain where I come from. I live in a small town in Kent. It's very beautiful. Not very keen, to be honest, on sharing it with tourists. And then once a year, this happens. There's a big hop festival. Same problem, big event, brings in lots of people. Quite a lot of local people actually leave the town, which is unfortunate. What started as a community event has become essentially a free pop festival in the middle of our historic town. Now, for me, one of the things that drove my interest in responsible tourism, which I'll talk about in a minute, was the question of what we mean by ecotourism. And I got very cross as I was traveling around the world with groups as a tour leader when I kept seeing the slogan, take only photographs, leave only footprints. Because it seems to me that that doesn't compensate the local community for having maintained the natural and cultural environment and all those historic buildings in your case, which is what's attracting the tourists. The tourists really need to leave some money behind. Now, what you've got in Jim, in your town, I think, is a situation where you are getting money left behind, and that's clear from the economic figures. So you're not in that terrible ecotourism trap of having the visitors but not the cash. I wanted just briefly to explain the other part of where I come from, which is this notion of taking responsibility for tourism, because the only way you can use tourism is if you take responsibility for it and use it to make better places for people to live in. Because great places to live are great places to visit. And you can very quickly tell when people have not understood this, when they talk about making better places for people to visit. Focus first has to be on making great places for people to live. So responsible tourism is about saying what you're doing to take responsibility for improving the way tourism works in your community. You obviously have to recognize greenhouse gases, plastic waste, and biodiversity, but more important, or at least as important locally, are the economic benefits for local people, but also, and this is the critical bit, enhancing the well-being of the host community. Now, I've already heard a little of what's happening in that regard, particularly during COVID, and it's clear that that is happening in your community. I'm sure that many local people would like more, but some of it is clearly happening, and I congratulate you on that. The next part, though, is about involving local people in deciding about what the town is going to be used for, what the city is to be used for, and looking at how tourism makes a positive contribution to the conservation, both of the natural resources, but also the cultural heritage. And clearly you've got some very attractive 19th century Victorian architecture. There are also some issues, I think, around inclusive employment from a responsible tourism position. But that's just by way of introduction to the fact that tourism is a polluting industry, partly because of all the travel, and particularly in your case, the cars, the greenhouse gas emissions. You've got litter and trampling. I've no doubt that you pay a high price for the management of the impacts that tourists have in your streets, maintaining the toilets and so on. You've got congestion in the public realm, which you can't control because it's an open access resource. And you've got social and economic impacts in the high street in terms of the kinds of shops that are available to you, and in terms of the kind of accommodation which is available for the local community, or often much more profitably for landlords for renting out as second homes or holiday lets. And we've seen the massive growth of Airbnb across America, as we have done in Europe. So I wanted just to remind us of the saying you often hear in Asia, which is that tourism is like a fire. You can cook your food on it, or it can burn your house down. Now, responsible tourism is about using tourism to make better places for people to live in. And that is really the critical question, because the question is, who does the place belong to? Now, Sir Colin Marshall, who was then chair of British Airways way back in 1994, let the cat out of the bag when he said that tourism and the travel industry is essentially the renting out for short-term lets of other people's environments. It's your high streets, your places, your public parks that the tourist is coming to visit. And it's clear that some people in the city will be making money from tourism, but many of the people who are paying for the facilities to be maintained are not necessarily benefiting from employment or from ownership of tourism resources. A British NGO ran a campaign for many years pointing out that we take our holidays in somebody else's homes, and that would be the case for the people who come to visit you. The question is, for any community, I think, who do you want to come? Who do you want to invite? Who do you want to target your marketing at? And when do you recognize that you've reached the limit of the number of people that you can comfortably accommodate? So what is going to be the future of Jim Thorpe? I think that's the question. And as Alan Kay said, he was the chief scientist in the UK in the 80s, the best way to predict the future is to invent it. in a way, it's in your hands. It's in the hands of the community and of the tourism business. And the question, I think, is, will Jim Thorpe be used by tourism? And I'd say right now it is being used by tourism. Or are you going to find a way to use tourism for the sustainable development of your community? And before you get angry with me, I would say you're already doing some of those things, but you probably need to do more of them going forward, because these pressures will not go away. Tourism is a social construct. It's what we construct for our visitors when they come to visit our communities. And every individual tourist builds up or destroys human values while they travel. And that's a critical question. Who is it that you want to attract? What's the socio-demographic of the people you particularly want to attract? Josh Krippendorf, who wrote really the first book about this back in '87, said that what it needs is rebellious tourists and rebellious locals. We need to reconstruct what we mean by tourism and the way we explain and the way we explore it. So if destinations are social constructs, and I think they are, there's some critical questions which are listed there. Who decides how a destination is promoted? And the problem is, it isn't just the official promotion agency. It's all the other people who may be selling travel to your place. So actually getting control of the way the place is presented and promoted is not an easy process. But should it be focused on what the community wants or on what the businesses want? And if it is the businesses, is that done through an association which includes all the businesses? But which businesses? And what are you going to do about the issues about home ownership as people buy second homes or buy homes to rent out on Airbnb? Big problem in the UK. I'd be really surprised if you don't have it in your city, which is people buying properties to rent out because they make much more money out of short-term lets. We now have specialist agencies in the UK who will switch your property between short-term lets and longer-term lets to maximize your revenue. That's become a business for some people. That obviously the revenues possible from that far outweigh what most individuals looking for a home can afford. Now, I don't doubt that you're successful. You are offering something which is unique, particularly in the context of where you are. You have a sense of place, and you're very different from other communities around you. What Ludlow does, which is a place I go back to, it's on the Welsh border. I go back there every year for the food festival. And I go there because when I'm there, I'm treated as a temporary resident. I'm treated like a local. And because I go every year, and you have 9% of your visitors coming back year on year, I get to know people in that community. But the question you need to focus on, I think, as a community is, are you concerned just with visitor numbers, or are you concerned with yield? And I think you should be worried about yield. It's what the community is going to make from tourism, which should drive your indicators of success, your KPIs, not just the numbers. And clearly, I think you're already there in understanding that. So to turn on specifically to over-tourism, I think the best definition is the one I came up with, because I would, wouldn't I? That over-tourism describes destinations where hosts or guests, locals or visitors, feel there are too many visitors and that the quality of life in the area or the quality of the experience has deteriorated unacceptably. And that, in a way, is Michael's point. It isn't just that over-tourism annoys the community, it will turn away some of your visitors. And I'd be interested to know, for example, whether your 9% repeat visitor figure is rising or falling. And if your repeat visitor figure is falling, that's a pretty clear indicator that you've got a declining destination. Over-tourism has provoked a massive response in Barcelona, but also in Seoul, in South Korea, for example. It's now a problem on all 4 continents. It's becoming a problem in Antarctica. It is a serious issue for more and more communities, and it's taken off like a rocket when it first came really to public prominence in 2015, which is only 8 years ago, but now everybody is talking about over-tourism. Now, tourism creates different kinds of value. It can create, for example, it can mitigate against out-migration. It can keep young people in communities because they see opportunities, creates vibrancy. It helps to maintain facilities and services. And I don't doubt that tourism is contributing to the vibrancy and the sense of life in your city. But on the other positive side, the economic, it creates value. It creates yield, but do you want to be a low value, high volume place or a low volume, high value place? And who's going to capture the value? The taxation figures that we heard about earlier are impressive in terms of the contribution of the tourism industry to the local state. But it is still a question of how profitable it is really for the place. So to use tourism or to be used by it is a critical question. Now, it seems to me that the reality is, and this is a real advert for cricketer holidays placed in Gardens Illustrated magazine. They only had it there for 1 month. They were unlucky that I saw it. Whenever a place gets spoiled, we move on, they said. And that's the warning for all of us, that when the place is spoiled, people move on. And there are some places on roads, for example, which were very successful tourist destinations in the 1930s, but which became spoilt and are no longer tourist destinations at all. So it is about moving from marketing to management. That's clearly the international trend. And Michael, you're absolutely right to pick up on that. That is the way that is developing. One of the problems, though, is that overtourism is not one thing. Overtourism is different in every place you look at it. And it's really important to work out what the proximate causes are of overtourism in your place from the point of view of the locals and the point of view of the tourists. They're almost two separate things. What's irritating the tourists? What's irritating the locals? And that's about the volume, the behavior, and the impacts that those tourists are having in the destination. And I saw in the newspaper report that one of your residents has actually been spat at by a tourist. If that isn't a warning that you've got a problem, assuming it happened and it's not just a myth that the local press are promoting, then you've got a problem, because when it's reached that point, clearly frustration on one side has built to an unacceptable level. Now, we've got some emerging principles, if you like, about dealing with overtourism. The first is that you've got to manage all the people who are there as one group. You've got to expect residents, commuters, visitors, and tourists all to obey the same rules, because you can't differentiate. Barcelona has very deliberately not scapegoated the tourist in this. But if you don't manage it, your community will begin to scapegoat the tourists. And that's unhealthy for your tourism economy if that happens. You've got to decide what degree of homogeneity you want to have. How much do you want the tourists who come to be the kinds of tourists who will just fit in easily into your community? The same kind of socio-demographic groups that you've got living in the city. You're definitely going to have to adopt a whole of government approach, where people just expect the tourism department or the tourism board or the tourism association to sort the problem out. It will always fail, because you need all the different agencies of government and all the agencies of the private sector to work together. And the only way you get that is to go for evidence-based management. People's ideas about what the priorities are need to be based in some evidence. And you also need to realize, and I think you do, that sustainability is fundamental to remaining a competitive destination in the long term. So you are going to need a whole of government approach, which means involving elected politicians and those who are governed through their administrative structures. You need to use promotion and management separately, but you need to make sure that your marketing efforts are part of your management system and not a separate thing. One of the problems about tourism internationally is what tourism people mean by marketing is normally promotion. If you think about what a car company does when it's marketing a car, has a clear idea of the profile of the consumer that they think is going to buy that vehicle. It's absolutely designed for a particular market segment. And that's something you need to think about, I think, in terms of the way you market your destination. And I would have we can talk about what my views about that might be. Every department of government has the capacity to assist. You can challenge me on that if you like. So the challenge is to use tourism rather than be used by it. The aspiration is to use tourism, but you have to ask these three questions. What do you want to offer? Who do you want to attract? And what causes over-tourism in Jim Thorpe, and when? Because you may not have, I don't think you have over-tourism 365 days a year. However bad it is, it won't be quite that bad. It's probably only 352 days a year, or whatever figure it is, but it isn't 365, which means you've got good days and bad days. What Barcelona does is to actually publish in advance a forecast for residents of which will be the over-touristed days, so the residents can stay in their back garden and don't get involved if they don't want to. That might be something that you could trial and see if it helps. So to come specifically, there are a few things that struck me from across the pond, as it were. The first is that if I'd seen that photograph anywhere, I'd have said, you got a problem. Michael described the problem, I think it was Michael, forgive me if it was someone else, but you got one road going through an obviously attractive valley with a historic town. That is designed to get an over-tourism problem. It's nobody's fault, it just is the way it is. The fact that it is such an attractive town only makes it worse. And I would suspect that these areas, whilst they will get visitors, get very few. The big concentration is here, and your car parks are all the way along the riverfront, which I always think is a great shame, because actually those riverfronts, see them in Britain too, with car parks. It's an obvious place to put the car park, but actually it's a really nice place to stroll as well. And strolling through a car park is not a great experience. But you're not completely free, are you, to choose where you put your car parks? You can't just demolish all that wonderful woodland and replace it with car parks. This would be a disaster of the first order. So then, and let me be clear, Chris did not send me this particular piece of evidence, but I did find Traffic-Geddon. Wasn't even looking for it, actually. I was looking for Jim Thorpe on Google. And Traffic-Geddon, I think this came up second. I think it was second on the page. And I probably don't need to remind you of this, but there may be listeners in here who've not heard it. And this is Chris, I think. We witnessed the proverbial tipping point on Saturday with Traffic-Geddon, the point at which one can reasonably say that even with seemingly our best efforts put forth to plan and execute, there is a collective failure to ensure quality of life aspects for residents, to including their health and welfare for them and visitors, specific to ensuring the capacity to deploy emergency services. Additionally, the downtown area of Jim Thorpe, which includes has reached a point of diminishing visitor experience, given the inability to reasonably and fully meet the restroom, restaurant, pedestrian flow activities and open space. That is a definition of over-tourism. If that's been reached, you've got it. You've got congestion, you've got insufficient parking, you've got the perfect storm, as it was described. You've got leaves at their peak, and you've got a festival on at the same time. I put the picture in there because one of the things that they discovered in Cornwall during the lockdown, when they have over-tourism for the first time, that really what they needed to do is turn the cars away 3 hours drive from where they were arriving. They needed signs up saying the place is full. That's it's not a cheap thing to do, but it's a relatively cheap thing to do, because once people have got to your city, when they've been queuing for 5 hours down Traffic-Geddon, they're going to be really hard to turn away. But if they know it's overcrowded and they get the message, don't come far enough away, they may divert to somewhere else. You will shift the problem, which may help. When I saw this, which is amongst the papers that Chris sent me, I thought, my goodness, there is the statement of the problem. You've got a relatively small amount of employment in terms of actual number of people employed, but look at the intensity of it. Between 35 and 40% of all the employees are working in tourism. which means you can't afford to allow that industry to decline. That would be a real mistake. And then we come to this. And again, the frustration for me of the figures is they were never detailed or local enough actually to be useful. But what this would suggest to us, I would guess that most of the accommodation, most of it, but not all of it, is locally owned. Some of it will be owned by people who no longer live in the city. The money will be going to New York or Washington or wherever. But I would guess most of that 14% actually does stay in the community. Obviously, Michael, in your case, I guess all of it does. But there'll be other business models where it doesn't. So let's say 10% of the tourism, of the lodging money stays in the local community. Of the recreation, I would guess most of that does, because the recreation facilities are normally owned by local businesses and local people. In terms of retail, well, quite a lot of that will be imported goods. So let's say 5%. Food and beverages doesn't look like a major agricultural area. So let's say 10%. And what you begin to see is it's not actually very much staying in the local economy. And that would be, for me, a critical question. Can you reshape your tourism to have smaller numbers, higher value, and higher yield for the local economy? That, I think, would be the traditional responsible tourism approach. Is that possible? Smaller numbers, higher value, with more retained value and yield for the local economy. And I would guess that over a period of time, you could probably generate that. I hope that's been at least a bit provocative. So turned everybody to silence anyway.
Right. So Harold, on your, I believe it was your penultimate, your next to last slide. So basically, if you're saying $1 million of let's say food and beverage, but the fact is a large percentage of that is really going out of county to the wholesalers, for example.
Chris,
So,
I don't know. I'm asking the question.
Right,
because the figures never tell you that question. And
right.
It's very frustrating about the way these tourism figures are put together. And it's not the fault of anybody on this panel. That's the way it's done.
Mm-hmm.
It's a problem everywhere, but it means your information base is not as strong as I would like it to be when you're thinking about these questions.
Mm-hmm. Well, that definitely makes developing a strategy difficult when you don't have the fine details. Kathy, what are your thoughts? Overall.
Overall, I agree with Harold. We definitely have an over-tourism problem now, and it's not just Jim Thorpe. In the summertime, it is Beltsville Lake State Park. And so, some of the things, Harold, that you've talked about is educating people, visitors, before they arrive here and have signage saying, it's closed, please turn around or whatever. We do that in the summertime with Beltsville. We put the signage up on the turnpike, people coming into the area from an hour or 2 hours away. Does it help? I don't know. We still seem to have that problem in that area. It's no easy answer. It's a conundrum that we have to deal with, parking and, overuse of facilities, not enough facilities, not just Jim Thorpe, but in other locations in the county. We're a popular destination because we're so close to New York and Philadelphia, two of the major cities in the East Coast. So yes, I agree. The problem does become management. The question I have is it too late for proper management to be set up so that we can mitigate these issues that we already seem to have? We seem to be more reactive than proactive lately. We do studies. We've done traffic and parking studies in Jim Thorpe for a whole year, just trying to see how people move, how pedestrians move, how the traffic moves. We've got the reports. We have everything I think that we need. I think we're missing a true path forward. I think we're missing a vision for that path forward and a map on how to get there.
Mm-hmm.
And
Kathy, can I come back on that? Because
sure.
I don't want to stir up apathy or fear. I think it's never too late. Let me be really clear about that. I just don't accept that.
Mm-hmm.
That it's going to be difficult, that I accept. But you're not past the point of no return. If your repeat visitor rate was down below 3%, I'd say you're in such dire trouble, perhaps just move your business somewhere else. But it isn't. It's still at 9%. But let me tell you, the Gambia, which is a tiny country in West Africa, entirely reliant on people spending a lot of money on an aeroplane to get there, it's got a 63% repeat visitor rate last time I looked. Now, if that's your criteria, then you're a long way off that. I do think watching your repeat visitor rate is probably a very key determinant for you to understand the consumer perception. What I would say to you about your studies, and I've written enough bloody studies to paper a mansion. I don't think this. I increasingly think the studies are not the point. Barcelona, I've written now three times. I've written up the history of the way Barcelona has dealt with over-tourism. And they have tried lots of different ways of doing it, some of which have worked, some of which have failed. But the point is they've had experiments. They've done things. So one of the things they did was to see what happened if they changed the exit. I know you don't have an exit, a metro system, but let me just use it as the example. They changed the entrances and the exits around the metro stations to change the way the tourists walked through the city. That had some positive impacts, has some new negative impacts. They changed it again. And I think that micromanagement and looking at what the impact is really helpful in working it out. Now, if you want to find out whether your signs are making any difference or not, switch them off.
Yeah.
But my fear would be that actually it would just be much worse. And maybe you should be moving those signs even further back down the freeway to head people off. Because the problem is once they're committed and they can't see alternatives, they're going to arrive. When they've sat in that goddamn queue, they're going to arrive. And really, you want to turn them back before they start queuing. Ideally, you want to turn them back before they leave home and suggest they go somewhere else. So I do think that demarketing has to be a part of your strategy. I was very close to the Ludlow Food and Drink Festival because I go there such a lot. I used to be part of organising it. They one year realised that they'd exceeded what the town could comfortably cope with. So the next year they didn't market the thing at all. And they got back to a healthy number. And when it dropped a bit, they did some more marketing. But they kind of decided what number of visitors they wanted and they adjusted their marketing budget each year. That's another method you can use. Now, I am not going to sit here in Britain telling you what to do. The one thing I would say is you've got to experiment. There's no other way. And the longer you leave experimenting, the closer you'll be to a bigger problem.
I agree. I'm going to jump in because Dr. Goodwin, I think the one thing we do have in Carbon County is great communication. So we knew that October was going to happen. So we started meeting a year prior as a group, everybody around the table that has a vested interest. And so we were prepared, in a lot of ways, and we had really good communication. I think we also brought in the national company a couple years ago to talk about parking and outside of the box thinking. And unfortunately, some of the leadership just didn't feel like they wanted to go that route. So I think, again, that there are solutions. I think it's just coming back around the table, continuing those discussions, and then all of us being a part of that solution. Because, again, we know October is it. We know that is the time we have to be prepared in Jim Thorpe, and we're going to continue to have those conversations. And as the TPA organization, we take responsibility. We spend over $500,000 a year to clean up the Poconos. We have also done surveys to residents. So we understand that importance so that we're getting a lot of what you said, getting that feedback so that we can better, prepare the visitor and guest and resident support.
Marlene, what I would say is that, again, the experiments really carry weight with those people who doubt what you're saying. The seeing the change that comes when you make those, and they're often quite small management changes, that changes it. So one thing you could do, which I don't know what the impact would be, but you could give the first people to arrive all-day parking. And then when the place is full, the place is full. There's no more parking. Don't come. I'm not saying you should do that, because it's not for me to say. All I'm saying is with parking, there's so many ways you can adjust the system on different days of the year. So in Britain, we have, I think from the 1st of April to the 30th of October, there's lots of places you can't park. In the winter, when we have no tourists, you can park there, but in the summer you can't. And there's just so much opportunity, particularly with parking, to change the regulations and the rules and the enforcement almost day by day to affect the number of visitors who are likely to arrive, provided that you warn people from far enough away that the place is full or not full, or there's space, whatever you want to say. But I would really encourage the experiments, because they carry weight when people see the consequences of your action.
Harold, one thing I would say, though, that's one area where we have made a concerted effort in is parking. However, what I do believe, though, that has taken 90% of our attention. So therefore, we're not looking at or experimenting in all the other areas where we need to accept the fact that we're going to fail at times, but we have to continue to experiment. And we're just kind of focused in on parking, traffic congestion, and you're treating a symptom. You're not treating.
No, Chris, I'm sorry to disagree with you.
Okay.
But let me explain. I'm not sure I'm right, but let me explain why, in principle, I think you may be missing the point here. The problem that Barcelona and Venice and Dubrovnik had with tourism, and still have, is they don't control arrivals.
Right.
Dubrovnik has managed to do something about it, because the mayor of Dubrovnik, interestingly, controls the number of cruise berthing points there are. So the mayor of Dubrovnik could cut the number of cruises. They now only allow 3 a day, and they have a maximum number of disembarked passengers. Venice and Barcelona are stuffed, because they don't control the port, they don't control the number of cruise lines, and they can't control the supply. Now, controlling demand is very difficult. It takes a long time to demarket a place. And if you go too far, obviously that's very disadvantageous. But the point I wanted to make about the cars is you're right to concentrate on that, because that is the supply constraint. That is where you can actually prevent the people arriving, because you don't get people coming in by rail. You've got a wonderful rail line, but they're not bringing the tourists in. So, and you obviously don't have cruise lines. So for me, I would start with the parking. I'm not saying it's the only problem, Chris, but I do think it's a major focus, because stopping the people arriving is a big part of your challenge, particularly on the over-visited days. So I think it's right to start there.
Yeah. I would add, we do have notably recently, after the county has sold the railroad, we have seen, and we sold the railroad about 2 years or so ago, we have seen a notable increase in train arrivals. We can have, I believe, once this fall, we actually had 1 organic train and then 3 come in, if I recall. During one, we have, that has been a big change, I think, in Jim Thorpe, hasn't it, Michael?
No question about it, Chris.
Yeah.
One of the observations that we have on a borough level this year, one of the greatest challenges we had is pedestrian traffic, and this is referring exactly to, and please don't misunderstand me, the train is a wonderful asset. However, we then, as the TPAs, the county, the borough, the JTTA, the responsibility of managing and accommodating these visitors has fallen on us. One of the negatives that I started to speak about is that simply because of the frustration that these visitors are having, whether or not they arrive on a train and now they're at a train station with quite literally thousands of other people. They're trying to manage one main intersection where there's just a short period of time on a walk cycle. What we had very, very high levels of disrespect to our Jim Thorpe police officers and to our local fire police, and in fact, other volunteers, honestly, myself included, where folks their frustration levels were so great, Doctor, that they stopped responding to direction to help make.
I'm afraid that is exactly what happens, Michael.
Mhm.
That's the Barcelona problem. When they come off the boats and come up to the bottom to the Rambla, they're unstoppable. It's like a human tidal wave. I didn't know about that, and that's obvious. That's a bigger problem than the cars, to be honest, and probably more difficult for you to administratively control if you no longer run the railroad.
Mhm.
I love your idea about trying to gain control and better manage arrivals. One of the other things, and again, it's a touchy subject, is Barcelona, parts of Italy, other parts of the country, I believe in the UK as well. They have stopped issuing permits for holiday homes, as you call them,
Mhm.
in certain areas. And by the way, let me rephrase that. Any accommodations, that includes hotels, bed and breakfast, short-term rentals, they have enough. They're full. And to tag on that, one of the challenges I think that we'll face here in the Poconos, certainly Monroe County, I understand, has this, is the vast majority of those holiday homes are not owned by residents. And
Yeah.
so
Right.
there's two parts to that. One, that revenue doesn't stay in the community. Two, the folks that control that future don't vote. And so they're not at the table trying to help determine the future of our four-county area.
Michael, they don't care.
Important.
Right.
They
Right.
don't care.
Right.
Mhm.
Michael, however, all that said, when I first started working on Overtourism in 2012, the example I was using of where they got it right was those parts of America where you have to pay local taxes if you're staying in a resort or accommodation. So, in a way, America was a leader at that point. A lot of the European response has been picked up from there, and we have begun to apply it, but it's incredibly divisive, you can imagine. But there is no alternative, because otherwise we've got the problem, and I think you're going to have it in the States if you haven't got it already, that lots of young people who've been born and bred in a place cannot afford to buy a house there because the tourism dollar has pushed the value of the housing beyond what they can afford to pay. And in some resorts now, it's so bad that they're having to build temporary accommodation for the guest workers who come in to staff the restaurants. It's
So,
complete nonsense once you get to that point.
no,
So, I
no,
mean, managing those things is a critical part. And that's where the town planners become really important in terms of what they'll permit and the taxation. So Barcelona, if they find that an Airbnb, which is not registered, they turn up with somebody from the city housing department with somebody from the tax authority. And you have two people on your doorstep asking what the hell you think you're doing. Been very effective. They found all but 200 of those businesses on Airbnb because they put the money into finding them. And they reckon those 200 are probably mafia controlled modern slavery places. So they can't find those, but they found all but 200 of thousands in Barcelona. But it is a matter of deploying the whole, I think, of the city administration to make them realize it's not just the responsibility of the tourism association, that it's something the whole community has got to respond to.
Harold, would you think the term demarketing again, that's a negative term. I would say if I was a business interest, and if you said demarketing, I mean, that would raise, if that word stood alone, that would raise a red
Yeah,
flag.
don't use that word.
Right, exactly. And that's my point. Yeah, I would never use the term demarketing because, again, to me, it's about increasing yield, no longer about increasing quantity, and you make that distinction. And I think that's
Chris, one of the things you could do, sorry to come with a practical suggestion.
Yeah.
One of the things you could do is just do one of these with some of the people who are working in those restaurants on the over touristed days and get them to talk about what that's like. Because other people who don't work in restaurants on those days will have no idea how unpleasant it is to be trying to serve people in that context. And that helps people to understand what the difficulty is. I was in York recently, and there was a queue of about 100 people waiting to get into Betty's, which is a coffee shop. And they're only trying to get in there because they want to get one of the napkins to take home and say, I was at Betty's, because it's an iconic place. Damn the influencers for having done that. But to work in that place is just a hellhole.
Mhm.
And I think that is, you just have to keep thinking about what's the specific issue, how can we raise awareness, how can we get people to understand that this isn't a great solution.
Mhm.
And it doesn't matter what they do with the price at Betty's, people still want to get their free napkin and get their selfie of themselves in Betty's because it's an iconic place to go.
Mhm.
But I do think it is always a matter of dealing with the detail. You can't deal with over tourism as a whole. You have to start to deal with the bits of it and try to manage it in different ways. And I'm not saying that you're not doing a lot already. I'm just trying to encourage you to do more, I guess, and be brave enough to experiment and build public support for an experiment.
Well, and again, it's seasonal, right? So
Oh yeah,
we
of
all,
course.
and we know that. That's the beauty of the Poconos, that we know fall is when we're going to see, and as Kathy had indicated, we know, some of our lakes, but for the most part, this isn't a yearly, like every month, thank goodness, right? So we have that opportunity where we're probably, I would say, Michael, we're going to start meeting again in January to look back and tackle, some of those challenges. And again, it's bathrooms, maybe it's moving towards, building more restrooms, like things like that, that I think that we do have that ability to be able to communicate and come together so that we're pre-planning, for October again.
But Marlon, allow me, if I may. One thing that's important is it's not just October anymore.
Yeah,
Jim
I agree.
Right.
did virtually 52 weekends a year.
Yeah.
To the point where here we are in December, we don't have a major festival. We have a very minor promotion of Old Time Christmas. It's music on the street. It's nothing. And we had to put our barricades back out to manage traffic. There's no two ways about it. We had to respond to the traffic load. What I'd like to do is to pick up on a conversation real quickly between Commissioner Lukasevich and the doctor and just say, I think the phrase, we kind of talked about it at the beginning of the meeting, the phrase about visitor information, visitor education is definitely going to be our focus this year. And I'm also going to agree that to look at ways to manage access. At some point, you're full. When you're full, you're full.
Yeah.
We literally were standing on the corner of Hill Road and Broadway this October, talking to people that have been driving in circles for hours and hours and going, guys, we love you. Come back tomorrow.
Yeah. Michael, and I would say you hit upon something about seeing it more frequently where we hit our max tourist carrying capacity. And again, I do it from a parking perspective because I always look at, hey, how many days throughout the year did the county lot hit full? And then how early in the day did it hit full? And anecdotally, and I know I can pull the data that would show even as we started, even in COVID, we started seeing an increase in the lot being closed. COVID was amazing here. I think for us, we started seeing, a 3-day weekend every Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. It was really unique. That's one of the things I was shocked by here in Carbon County.
But Chris, if I could just say so, that was the British experience as well, because where people are traveling by car with their family, they're safely locked away. They feel safe to travel. They want to go somewhere where they can walk about outside, which they were permitted to do in the UK during some phases of lockdown. So places like Faversham suddenly got a lot more visitors than we would get ordinarily. And I think, having systems in place that enable us to respond more quickly to changes in visitor arrivals is really critical. And I would suggest that you experiment more with turning the cars back earlier, further down the freeway. And
I think it's fascinating.
I think you have to try that.
It's good to look at who has done this right as well, Doctor. Our national parks started doing limited access, reservation only several years ago. And the national parks were one of the first to use the term overtourism in this country. And they've done an outstanding job because the reality is, again, you started our meeting with this. You want to preserve the very reason people come.
All right. So let's go ahead. We just have a couple minutes. So I want to just go around the horn real quick for final comments and final thoughts. Kathy, Your final thoughts, final comment.
So the opportunity, I always like to look at opportunities. The opportunities that we have are we have other towns close by Jim Thorpe that are also have a lot of history that need a lot of help. They're blighted communities right now. So I think the opportunity is to direct tourists to other locations in our county, but also to help those small boroughs, however they need help, to bring about change in there, as well as taking care of those blighted properties and enhancing the historical value, the historic tourism that is available in those communities, which we're working on now with some different projects.
All right. Well, thank you, Kathy. Marlon, over to you.
I think Dr. Goodwin, thank you. So a lot of really good insight today. I definitely picked up on the importance of visitor information and education. And I wrote down manage visitor arrivals, like things I think that we could really be proactive as an organization. You know, we have 5 million people that go to our website a year. So we have that ability to put those messages out early. So I thank you for your insight, and it is a pleasure working with this group, because we definitely have great communication, and we just need to take those risks, like you said.
All right.
Brave.
Michael, how about you?
And I'm going to tie in on that. And Marlon, I can say that the JTTA is absolutely on board for educating people on creating the very best arrival experience only through pre-planning. And certainly even the borough of Jim Thorpe is on board for trying to look at ways to better manage pedestrian and vehicular traffic. So what I will say is thank you very much. And, you know, we didn't even talk about this 4 years ago. So it's warts and all, it's come a long way. Basically, it's the people on the screen.
Yep, sounds good. And Harold, for your final,
Can I just say I'm very impressed actually by the extent to which you're to get all together on this. My biggest concern as we come to the end of this is whether you can, through some kind of city ordinance, get some control over arrivals by rail, because I think that's a real, potentially a massive problem. Because all those people who paid for a ticket and are unable to get something to eat and are crowded on those platforms, I don't know. I think that's a big public education campaign to turn back. I think that's a real problem.
Well, we have some private interests we're dealing with there, so that can be challenging.
It will be.
All right.
I can only sympathize on that one, Chris. I haven't come across that anywhere else yet.
Yeah. Well, again, I want to thank each and every one of you for participating in this conversation today. Harold, thank you for bringing some extended context to the concept of over-tourism, characteristics of it that you've seen elsewhere, talking a little bit about strategies and how to deal with some of the challenges we have here. I'd like to extend an invitation to you to come and lodge at the Dolan House and experience firsthand in October Jim Thorpe. It is an amazing, Jim Thorpe, Carbon County is amazing. So the entire Pocono region, it's just a mecca of tourism. It's just chock full of activities year round. So again, thank you so much for your expertise, Harold.
Thank you for the opportunity.
All right.
Thank you all.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Cheers. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Chris, did we do what? Sorry.
Yep, I'm gonna let me make sure I got my stream stopped here. Stop recording. So hold on, let me make sure my stream is stopped. Live stream service. Hold